Well, I actually was born in Deadwood, South Dakota on December 18th, 1941, and grew up there. My parents had a restaurant in Deadwood, so starting at a very young age, I was working at the restaurant and worked my way up to where I was finally a fry cook. And you, uh, you know the old idea that you work at a certain place and get to a certain level and start thinking, I don't really like to do this very much. So I decided that I was going to be an elementary school teacher, and I went over to Black Hills Teachers College after I graduated from high school, and I started studying elementary school teachers materials. And after about 3.5, 4 years, the person that I was reporting to over at BHTC called me in and had a kind of a frank conversation with me. Told me that they really didn't think that I was cut out to be an elementary school teacher. And I said, well, what do you think I can do? And she said, well, there's probably a number of things you can do, but have you ever thought about joining the service, becoming a military person? And I said, no, I sure have given it some thought, and it's not something I have any interest in at all. So I started thinking after that, and it was a little bit of a shocker to me. I started thinking about what I might do. So I found out, well, maybe I'll become a lawyer. So I got hold of the University of Denver as well as the University of South Dakota and sent them my grades, which weren't terrible, but weren't real great either. And finally, the dean from the University of South Dakota was going to be in the Black Hills on vacation. So he said that he would be happy to sit down and talk to me. So we met, and he took me out to lunch. We had a nice lunch together and never talked about anything other than just, what I'd kind of like to do and a little bit about my background. And he finally said, well, you're kind of borderline in terms of your grades, but I'm still gonna let you come in. We've got a couple spaces left. So I went to the University of South Dakota down in Vermillion and started out with in about 1964. And lo and behold, I started getting a little bit better grades. And went down there for 3 years, had a great experience. And from probably being in the bottom part of my high school class, when I got to law school, I ended up along with Virgil Johnson, who has become my partner down here. We were a couple of the top students. I then came to Omaha because I'd heard that there was some possible jobs, and I sent out my resume to 4 or 5 different law firms, and I was invited to come down by a couple of them. One of them had notified me a couple days before I was supposed to be here for the interview that they had already made a decision and they hired somebody else. And but I still came down and I interviewed the other law firm, and that was Swenson and Erickson. And Dick Swenson was the Swedish consul in Omaha, and he took care of all sorts of Swedish matters all over a 7-state area. And so I was taken to his house, and they had a nice dinner for me. And once again, didn't ask me about any of my background that much, just had a pleasant conversation about life and about, where someday I'd like to be. And he walked me to the back steps. I went down, was getting in my car. He said, okay, we want you to come to work for us. And they gave me a price, which today would be a total shocker. And I always remind the new guys that come into our firm what I had to start at. And every one of them accuses me of lying to them. But in any event, I came down, and I was not smart enough to understand the real reason that I got the job. And it turns out that what they needed was somebody to take over some of the work at the consulate, and they needed somebody with a Swedish name, and they needed somebody with a background as a heritage in Sweden. And so that was the principal reason. But he did tell me as I was leaving his house, he said, oh, by the way, you are Lutheran, aren't you? And I wasn't. I was Methodist. And I thought, well, it's a little bit early to start lying to my new boss. So basically I says, if it's absolutely necessary, yes. And that was it. Came down, started working on all sorts of matters with him, and that was 1967. And we continued on. I was probably working with Don Erickson more than I was with Dick. And Dick and Don weren't getting along real well at that point because Dick was heavily involved in real estate. He was buying and selling different things in this state and other states. And Don was working all the time. And he just didn't like the idea that Dick wasn't putting in his efforts. So one day, close to Christmas, Don had a party over at his house. And as we were walking to the door, he said, Chuck, I'm leaving the firm, and I want you to come with me. And I was there again. I was very shocked. And I said, well, I've been working with you very closely, so I'd certainly consider that. And one other guy by the name of Tom Guilfoyle was in the firm, and he ended up staying with Dick. I went with Don, and we went over to the Service Life building downtown and got a small office. And all of the people that I knew in town would give me all sorts of problems. And they'd say, well, Dick and Don got a divorce and they had split custody of the two kids. So that's where we started with Don. And
so it was the four of you?
We split up.
Okay.
And so Don and I were by ourselves, and Dick and Tom were by themselves. And so after about a year, Don invited me to join the partnership, and we changed the name to Erickson Sederstrom, and took off from there. And Don, I think he's been gone about 10 years now, but even in his 80s, he was still here at the office and not doing much work, but at least around keeping everybody occupied. Great experience.
When did Tom come back into the fold?
About 7-8 years ago, came back, and he's pretty much retired now. But as I am, I come to the office every day, but I'm not silly enough to start trying to practice law anymore. I pass that on to somebody else. As I say, I was generally hired because of the Swedish connection, and Emmanuel was, of course, had a Swedish heritage as well. And at that time, they had deaconesses that were pretty much running the place. And I had been in Omaha for about 10 days, and I was living in an apartment that I had just rented way out north. And in the middle of the night, one night, all of the alarms went off, fire alarms. And I went to the door of my apartment and tried to get out, and I could not get out. So the only way for me to get out, and I was on the 3rd floor, is to get out the window. So I got out, jumped out of the window, and it turned out that I had some compression fractures and a leg that was injured and an arm that was injured. And pretty soon the police, or the firemen, come around, and they put me on a cart, took me out, and they put me in an ambulance. That ambulance took off, and I was up on Ames Street, is where I was living, at probably about 40th and Ames, in an apartment building. And they started out, and I said, you have to take me to Emmanuel Hospital, because that was one of the jobs I was going to be taking over in due course, was to work at Emmanuel. And they said, no, we've already taken people there. We're going to take you down to Douglas County. So they took me all the way downtown to the old Douglas County Hospital, and took me in, and they x-rayed me, and they found out where the breaks were, and they applied, my leg was in a cast, my arm was in a cast, and I had to wear a back brace for about just 4 or 5 months. When they finished doing all of that, I said, I can't stay here. I've got to go to Emmanuel. And they said, you just can't. And I said, well, I'm going to leave then, and I'll get a cab, and I'll go up there. And I explained to them what the situation was. And you might wonder, why was that so important to me when I hadn't even started at Emmanuel? Well, growing up in Deadwood, particularly in the restaurant business, we always did business with the same druggist that did business with us. And if that person never came in our restaurant, we never went in the drugstore, and vice versa. So that was very, very typical of the small commercial businesses up in Deadwood at that time. And I thought the same thing, that if I went to a competitor of Emmanuel, they would never want me to do anything for them as long as I lived. So it was all motivated by my fear of losing a client. So I get up to Emmanuel, and I had never met anybody up there. And at that time, the person that was kind of running the operation was a guy by the name of, Hans Link was the chief financial officer, and Sister Ingeborg Bloomberg. And I met them for the first time. And we really got along very, very well, particularly with Hans, who was a refugee from Germany, had a real deep brogue. And so I got acquainted with him at that time. And from that point on, I started representing Emmanuel. And I was very much involved in the original agreement to go with Methodist and have a joint operating agreement. And then we added a couple other hospitals after that. And eventually it became Allegiant Health, where we had hospitals across the state that were all affiliated. So I was doing all of that for them at the time. And then I think now about 8 or 10 years ago, CHI, Catholic Health, came in, and they actually bought from Emmanuel. They were half owners at the time anyway because of Bergen. They bought from, they bought from Emmanuel their half of the hospital business. And so it became went from Allegiant to CHI at that time. And I stayed around for a couple of years. I was always affiliated with the firm, but I spent 100% of my time on Allegiant business.
That's right.
Well, you are, and it isn't just law. Pretty soon you're very involved in management issues and everything else. So even though you have the principal responsibility for law, you are very, very much involved in a lot of management matters. As a matter of fact, most of the legal matters we would farm out to other law firms in town, depending upon their level of expertise. So there's certain law firms that are very good in employment matters, others that are very good in tax matters, and so we make a selection of those. So in terms of doing the work, I didn't do an awful lot of the work, but I did oversee the work that was being done. I think that there was one day I was here minding my own business, and a couple of guys that were members, and I was a member, came down and asked me, and it became obvious during the conversation that I wasn't going to get rid of them. They were going to stay here until I finally agreed. And so I did, and then it was a while after that I became the president. And it's changed a lot. It's a great organization. We have everybody in our law firm a member, and even some of our lawyers down in Lincoln are members of the Omaha Bar. Yes, I think that there's a couple things. Don Erickson always told me from one of the first days that I was at the office that you've got to start participating in some public matters. You have to get involved in organizations. You have to be active in all of those organizations. And they said, not because you're going to necessarily get any business, but it's very important that you know enough people and they know you, so that if somebody did ask them one day, what about Chuck Sederstrom? Is he a decent human being? They wouldn't immediately say, no, he really isn't. And so Don preached that, and he gave us time to do it. He made sure that we were in civic organizations, and always made sure that the firm was paying for that, so that we didn't have the excuse that we didn't have the money for it. The other thing is that I think is a core principle of the practice of law, and probably in my mind one of the most important thing, is that we all get out of school with a good understanding of the law, and I think we're all aggressive enough that we're going to research, we're going to try to do the best job we possibly can. What we sometimes forget is that there's a client on the other end of all of this, and that you have to be cautious of how you do the billing. You have to be always very responsive to what their needs are. And if somebody calls you or you say you're going to call them, then you have to follow up on your word. Because too often the client might be sitting at home waiting for that 10:30 call that you promised to make, and you don't do it until 11:30. And you're not thinking too much about that. You're busy or something and you just don't do it. That has a big impact on clients and what your relationship with them will be. The other thing is you should spend as much time looking over your bills as you do in anything else, because nothing will irritate a client more than to get a bill that says $35 and the definition of it or the description on it is unattended telephone conversation or something like that. So you call somebody and they're not there and you charge for them. Client looks at the bill an awful lot more than you do. So you want to make sure that it is done in a way that the client is not going to be offended by it. And then obviously you want to be a good lawyer and a responsive lawyer and let people know where you're standing at all times. Well, we kind of got into some of the political things because we hired Charlie Thone after he was several times U.S. representative and then the governor. And Charlie was a great guy and a great fellow to have around. We did a little lobbying, and we have a lobbying firm that we own, but we have tried to stay away from being too much identified one side or the other. Sometimes we get more identified as the Republicans. We have way more Democrats and Catholics in our firm than we do Protestant Republicans. So because of Creighton, and everybody wanted to go to Creighton, but we've always been kind of close to a lot of the political things that have gone on. And lawyers have to be a little bit careful too, because you know, it's never in the newspaper that you gave handsomely to your church, but you give handsomely to a political campaign, and everyone knows your name. And you'd be amazed at how many people are offended when they discover all of a sudden that you're on a different plane than they are. So you got to be awful careful of that. Yeah, you have to manage your time appropriately, because if you're on too many things, obviously, they all require a certain amount of time. And I've always felt that I had to perform. I had to, if I said I was going to be at all the meetings, I'll be at all the meetings. As I get older, I'm not following that rule quite as much as I did when I was younger. But you know, I've enjoyed being in some various organizations. I like the charitable organizations, and they've taught me a lot. And there's a lot of good people that you run into in those things. But I don't know as I'd want to go back and do them all over again.
Or what was the motivation behind that?
Well, you know, I never really, I knew lawyers from being in Deadwood, but it was not what my picture of a lawyer really was. They were older guys and so on. And, you know, I thought when I came down and I was accepted as law school, I just thought it would be great to be a lawyer. And if I didn't want to be a lawyer, I could always do something else. And the more I got into reading the cases and finding out a little bit about the law, I went from being that relatively poor student in high school to a relatively good student in law school, and just because of I was interested in it. And then when I came to Omaha, and I started meeting people, I started meeting clients, I started working with them. It was very, very enjoyable. This has never been a job. It's been something I've come to every day. Even now that I'm essentially retired, it's never past 9 o'clock in the morning when I show up at the office every single work day, and usually for a while on Saturday, because this is a place that I grew old in. And my wife, I think it's nice for my wife too, because I get out of the house. I'd probably drive her nuts if I stayed there. But I've enjoyed being a lawyer. I've enjoyed helping people from time to time. And I've enjoyed very, very much meeting the businesses and the individuals here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is the biggest city that I ever saw in my life when I first came here, and I love it.
And it has changed quite a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Over the years.
We didn't have a West Roads. This was farm ground out here.
Right.
I remember when in Regency, the first time I ever came here, there was absolutely nothing. It was just a big hill out there, and they were starting to do some grading in different places and so on. But much, much different today than it was back then.
And when did y'all move into the space?
Well, we've been out here for probably in the Regency area for probably about 20 years now.
Okay.
We went over in the Bozell and Jacobs building right after it was built originally, and
the Lincoln operation, how long has that been in existence?
we did that about 20 years ago,
Okay.
and a number of the people that were young then have retired. One of them, just the other day, we went down, took out for a big dinner that had just retired from the firm.
Well, and it's Erickson, Sederstrom, and Klein Williams are kind of the two firms that I always think of have the two operations of significant size.
There are several others, but I think we probably have done it longer.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing that I would say is that it's been great being in Omaha. It's really been great getting acquainted with many nonprofit organizations. And I've always enjoyed very much being a member of the local bar as well as the state bar. And I'm not as active anymore as I once was, but it's great. You guys do a great job.
I appreciate that.
I'll say one other thing
yeah.
about here. It is the one place I have been, and I've done a lot of traveling around, one place that I've been where lawyers are generally very kind to one another, very courteous, one place in the world that you can trust just about any lawyer that you deal with. And that isn't always true across the country. So I think it's a wonderful thing to say about lawyers, that they get along as well out here and are as trustful as they are of one another.
There we have so.
The other thing about when I first came down here, I was amazed at how many of the older lawyers in town, that once you got to know them, how helpful they were to you, and how they would, if they were on the other side, they'd help you. They would if you made a mistake on something, they would tell you that you made the mistake, so they wouldn't use it to get it over on you. So
unlike Washington D.C.
Yes.
as a place in comparison, and
Yeah.
tell you what, watch what you say out there, because it's ammo back at you very quickly.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for your
Okay.
time. I really do appreciate it.
My pleasure.